Hello, class. Professor Vanderbilt back. Last lecture, we ended up with the life of Leland Stanford. So now we want to talk about another railroad tycoon and some other things associated with railroads because they were the centerpiece of the Second Industrial Revolution in America during the Gilded Age. Next person I want to talk about is a New Yorker. His name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt had a pretty amazing life. He started out his career in industry by owning a line of steamships that sailed up the Hudson River from New York and took cargo to be placed on the Erie Canal, which then obviously ended up in western New York, out onto the Great Lakes, and all the way to the Midwest. Because when the Erie Canal was completed in 1824, it was really the centerpiece of transportation connecting New York City really to Chicago via water routes. Now, this is before railroads became prevalent in America, and by the 1840s, thanks to people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, railroads are going to basically make canals obsolete. And Vanderbilt's going to be at the forefront of this. Even though he amassed his initial fortune shipping items via water. So, the railroad that he's going to make all of his money off of is the Central Pacific Railroad Company. You can see that labeled sort of vaguely on that same map on page 594, right across New York State. But the Central Pacific Railroad holdings amounted to about 4,500 miles of track, and it connected New York to Albany, Albany to Boston, and Albany to Chicago. And it ran right next to the Erie Canal, and because it was faster and cheaper, it basically put the Erie Canal out of business. So, Cornelius Vanderbilt made a tremendous amount of money on the New York Central Railroad Company. And because he was a pioneer, so to speak, in the railroad industry, he's going to be responsible for a couple very important reforms to railroads in America. He's going to be the person that figures out that iron is not a good material to manufacture the rails that trains run on. And the reason why? Steel is much better. Iron can only hold so much weight, and it rusts much faster and deteriorates than steel does. Steel can hold a tremendous amount of more cargo per car than iron rails. So Vanderbilt will be the first one to start routinely using steel rails, which are much more expensive than iron rails, for all the New York Central Railroad. All of his competitors will follow suit because he'll bury his railroad competitors if they continue to use iron rail. He is going to be partially responsible for really creating the demand that then built the gigantic steel industry in this country by people like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan to fulfill this demand for steel. But it's the demand initially by railroad companies, specifically the New York Central Railroad, that really spikes the demand for steel and forces people to react to this and build all these steel mills. Now, another thing that Vanderbilt did that'll transform railroads in America is he is the one who went to Congress and demanded that if you're going to subsidize the building of railroads first across the country and then all around the country, like the federal and state governments did, they spent billions subsidizing the construction of railroads. You need to have one standard gauge. Back when Vanderbilt first got into the railroad business, there were several different gauges for railroads. What a gauge is in railroad terms is the width between the two tracks. And, some were wider, some were more narrow. There's smaller gauges, larger gauges. Vanderbilt told the government, I don't care which gauge you pick one though. So it'll be the standard gauge for every single company in America, especially those who take subsidies. And that way, everyone's rail cars can travel on everyone else's tracks. That's why today, when if you're stopped and a train's going by, up here it's the CNN, Canadian National Railroad, or whatever that stands for. But you'll see cars hooked to it from a whole bunch of different other railroad companies because they can all run on the same standard gauge tracks. Vanderbilt's the one to force Congress to do that, and it only makes perfect sense because otherwise you'd have to unload a rail car, put the cargo in a different gauged car. For example, let's say you were shipping something on the New York Central Railroad to Chicago, but you wanted to ultimately end up in St. Louis. Well, let's say that the railroad track between Chicago and St. Louis was a different gauge. Instead of just hooking the New York Central Railroad car onto another train from that different company, you'd have to unload everything and reload it on a different car. What a waste of time, money, labor, and so forth. Simple breakthrough, but somebody had to do it. So, when Vanderbilt dies in 1877, New York Central Railroad will have 4,500 miles of track. His son will then also parlay his success because he'll be the one who builds the Long Island Railroad and parts of the subway system in New York City to even make the Vanderbilt fortune even larger. And the Vanderbilts, Cornelius Vanderbilt was a robber baron. He didn't share his wealth. Yet, yes, he gave $1 million seed money to start the university in Tennessee that bears his name, Vanderbilt, but that's it. He left all of his money to his heirs, like robber barons did, kept it in the family, so to speak. There are Vanderbilts today who are still spending Cornelius Vanderbilt's fortune. Now, luckily, some of his descendants were smart enough to donate the Vanderbilt Mansion in Hyde Park, New York. I don't know if any of you have toured it. It's a national park today, to the United States, and the Park Service took it over. And it's one of the mansions of the Gilded Age that you can tour. It's just down the street from Springwood, where Franklin Roosevelt lived, in Hyde Park, New York, on the Hudson. To give you an example of a Vanderbilt still spending the Vanderbilt fortune, all of you have probably heard of Anderson Cooper, one of the main, news guys on CNN. His mother, who recently passed away less than a year ago, was Gloria Vanderbilt, the famous designer. She created her design company with Vanderbilt money she inherited from, indirectly, Cornelius Vanderbilt. So Anderson Cooper, who now obviously inherited his mother's fortune, is still spending Vanderbilt money, and his adopted son will be spending it also. So the legacy lives on in the Vanderbilt family. And a lot of robber barons, like the Rockefellers, are still spending John D. Rockefeller's fortune. We'll talk about Rockefeller later. But back to railroads. Another thing that I want to mention, some innovations that happened in the late 1860s concerning railroads that'll transform America. First one happens in 1867. That's the refrigerated rail car. That will transform the food industry and the cattle industry and livestock industry in America. Once you have a refrigerated rail car, you can safely transport all forms of food coast to coast. And this is what's going to end up making Chicago the meat packing capital of America back in this day and age. And it's still a very large meat packing center. The stockyards in Chicago are the size of the city of Plattsburgh. So, the reason why? You could process cattle and other meat products that were grown elsewhere. They were shipped by rail from Texas, Oklahoma, and so forth to Chicago, processed in the meat packing plants, and then distributed throughout the country via refrigerated rail car. This all happened because of this innovation. And today, we take it for granted. That's how, why you can eat fresh broccoli in the middle of February here in the North Country. It's grown in a field in California, but put on a train and shipped to us in refrigerated rail cars, obviously. Another big breakthrough was in 1868, and that is the creation of the automatic coupler. The automatic coupler allowed rail cars, as you may have seen before, witnessed, a couple rail cars just bump into each other and then they lock together with these automatic couplers that, with a mechanism, open up, they run into each other and then close. Before that invention in 1868, you literally had to line up two tongues on different railroad cars, which had a hole in it, and drop a pin through it to hold them together. Very time-consuming, very dangerous. Automatic coupler transformed everything. You could put the train together that was a mile long in a matter of an hour instead of what probably took days to do. Another big breakthrough, the creation of the air brake by Westinghouse in 1869. Before air braking systems were built for railroads, they had what amounted to an old-fashioned drum system. And it was impossible to really stop a train without, having a long time period to have it come to a halt. You've probably seen old movies where you got the engineer in the, locomotive pulling back on a big lever to stop the train, and you hear all this screeching and sparks flying and so forth. That's why original railroads, they had to build their stations using gravity. A station would usually be up on a hill, so a train had to come uphill. Then with the assistance of these old braking systems, they could come to a stop at the railroad station. With braking systems, air braking systems, you don't need that anymore. Westinghouse was the one who invented it. Obviously, Westinghouse parlayed that success into many other things. Westinghouse Corporation still exists today. They make anything from, refrigerators to, missile systems, and they still manufacture air brakes. Westinghouse, a subsidiary of it, has a plant right on the Air Force Base that makes braking systems for the rail cars that Bombardier manufactures. So, those breakthroughs all take place in the late 1860s. Another thing I want to mention about how railroads changed America forever was the concept of time. Now, once you got a train traveling coast to coast from New York to San Francisco, you had to come up with a schedule. But the problem was, nobody really knew what time it was outside of the city where you lived. So, for example, in New York City, when the sun was directly overhead, it was some city official's responsibility to set off a signal. In the old days, they'd fire a cannon. Later on, maybe they'd blow a whistle or whatever, right exactly at noon in New York City, according to the sun. Now, to give you an idea, it would be noon 12 minutes later in Boston due to the way the sun tracked, and so on and so forth. So there's a different noon in Albany, there's a different noon in Pittsburgh, and there's a different noon, obviously, in Chicago, and so forth. So when you're trying to make a train schedule and have people know what time the train's going to show up at your particular station, let's say you're waiting for a train in Pittsburgh and it left New York City. Well, it's going to arrive at such and such a time, and you're going to catch it to take it to Chicago. Whose time is it arriving? New York time? Pittsburgh time? Chicago time? What time? So, railroad companies, in an effort to create schedules and also for safety's sake, because trains had to know who's going to be on what track at what time so they don't collide. So, railroad companies first came up with our first set of time zones in America. The initial time zones they created in the 1870s, there were 50 time zones. They divided America up into 50 segments. Obviously, that's a start, but it didn't work very well. You need a suitcase to carry the schedules you'd need if you're traveling coast to coast with 50 time zones in the United States. So, ultimately, the system was created that we use today, where they divided the world into 24 time zones, 4 of which exist in the continental United States. Obviously, we're in the Eastern time zone, Chicago's in the Central, Denver's in the Mountain time zone, San Francisco's in the Pacific time zone. Boy, oh boy, did that transform everything. So you can really say railroads transformed the world citizens' concept of time itself. So they created this 24-hour time zones in 1883. But some things never change. Congress didn't adopt that same time zone system until 1918. Railroads around the world had been using it since 1883. Congress typically is always the last to catch on to anything important, as you may well know. So, one other thing I want to talk to you about with railroads today is the North Country's railroad tycoon. A man by the name, if you went to Shazy Central School District, you know who it is. It's William H. Miner. Now, there's a really great PBS video on his life that Steve Frederick produced for Mountain Lake or independently, I believe, that you may be able to find online. If not, if you're really interested in it, you can purchase a copy for not very much. I know I own a copy. I think it was like $15 from the Miner Institute in Shazy that is all about Miner's amazing life. William H. Miner is the North Country's railroad tycoon. He's got a pretty amazing life, and obviously, as you may already know, he was not a robber baron. He was a man with a heart of gold. In fact, he was an orphan as a child and was raised on his uncle's farm in Shazy, New York. When he became a young adult, he traveled west, lived in Indiana for a while, started going to college. Ultimately, he got jobs in the railroad industry in Chicago. Then he ventured out on his own and started William H. Miner Corporation. And the centerpiece of his company was a drafting device, which is a device that sits behind an automatic coupler that I was explaining to you, with springs and so forth in it that absorb the shock of the two trains bumping into each other. He made the best drafting device on the market, patented it, and made a fortune from it. Then, once he made his fortune, he decided to move back where he was from, the Chazy area. He inherited his uncle's farm, then started buying up thousands of acres surrounding it, and built this showcase of a farm operation known as Heart's Delight Farm. It's a beautiful thing. You can go and tour the museum there on the grounds of the Miner Institute during the summertime and when it's not closed due to COVID. And they have dioramas of it, videos in there. It's a really great place to visit. He knew and really had an appreciation for what farmers did for America and fed the world, and he wanted to do as much as he could to have innovations in that area. Also being a, more or less sort of a engineer slash scientist, he had massive projects where he was damming up the Little Chazy River with hydroelectric dams. One of the remnants of that exists out in Altona. And he brought electricity to his farm and electricity to the village of Chazy out of the kindness of his heart. And in fact, when he brought electricity to the village of Chazy, the one reason why he really did it was to build the magnificent Chazy Central School. The old original school was a masterpiece made of brick and marble. And the Chazy Central School in the village of Chazy and Heart's Delight's farm had electricity before the governor's mansion did in Albany. That's how far ahead of his time he was. He built that school, gave it to the citizens of Chazy. He also is the person who built CVPH. He was a man with a heart of gold. And he and his wife, Alice, who you can visit the Alice T. Miner Museum, with her eclectic collection of everything ranging from letters from George Washington and Thomas Jefferson to China that was in the Lincoln White House, to dolls, to everything you can imagine. She collected it because she had the money to do so and didn't have any children. That's all housed in that stone building in front of the Chazy Central School on Route 9 in Chazy. Great place to visit. He and his wife left their fortune to the North Country. They left endowments to CVPH. They created the Miner Institute, which still educates people in agricultural studies and veterinary studies and livestock studies, today in cooperation with the University of Vermont and Cornell University. You can visit that institute also. He left money to other worthy causes like the Kent DeLord House in Plattsburgh, which still spends his endowment every year to operate that house museum. Chazy Central School has an endowment left to him by the Miner, or left to them by the Miner family, that is part of their budget every year. Sort of like Leland Stanford and Stanford University, except at a smaller scale. So, William H. Miner is the North Country's tycoon, and he's not a robber baron. We were awful lucky to have him, and we're still reaping the benefits of the great William H. Miner and his wife, Alice. So, that's the end of this lecture. Next time, we're going to pick up with some corruption associated with the railroads. Surprise, surprise, corruption in the Gilded Age. And then we're going to talk about the amazing lives of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. So I'm going to take another break, get a drink of water, stretch my legs, and I'll talk to you shortly. Bye now.